Into the Fog, Part 2, Release. An original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Day 21. Michael's eyes fluttered open from the dream of Blue sitting outside the windows, eyes shining as her lips peeled over misshapen, cluttered fangs into a human smile. She lifted her paw, toes like malformed fingers, and tapped her nail on the glass. But each one came like thunder. Thud, thud, thud. She knocked. He stretched his eyes as the dream faded, but the bangs continued, louder and louder. He shot upright on the pantry floor, shotgun at the ready as his eyes flicked around the room until he remembered where he was. He took a sharp breath, pulling himself up and making his way to the door by the light seeping in beneath it. He craned the door open and peeked his head and barrel out. Thud, thud, thud came the front door. Then the wall, then the front window cracked and groaned from a blow. He pulled himself out into the light of morning and walked on tiptoe, heart racing and mind alert like he'd never slept. He pressed against the wall and peeked around the corner of the kitchen archway, staring at the front door and the other windows surrounding the living room and sitting area. The glass was still intact. The bars had held, the doors were still shut, and their braces weren't splintered or cracked. Only the front window opposite the couch was damaged. Twin spider webs branched from the center of the window, somehow not shattered and falling in. "I'll have to tape that later," he thought. Then he straightened, eyes falling back on the front door and the leering silence. Then came the roar. Michael jumped and lifted the barrels, mouth shut tight as he crept nearer the broken window to hide in the mass of cracks by the sill. Blue, or what she'd become, paced the front yard, snarling, pale eyes aglow in the fog's light. She was the size of a tiger, but shaped like a hyena or a gorilla, muscle rippling across her arms and back, bands of it jutting out from beneath her skin. Her silvery gray fur was gone on the underside, pale pink skin burning through her pelt, but the bristles on her back were clumped together like she were wet, glossy, hard, and sharp. She shook her head as she went back and forth, lips peeling over her crooked fangs, eyebrows downturned like a person, before she let out a human shout and rammed Michael's car with her shoulder. She sank her teeth into the tires, busted his windshield, clawed his doors and roof. Blood dripped from her lips as she panted and looked up at the shifting, shadowy mass emerging in the fog. She leapt down from the car and rose onto her hind legs like a bear, finger-like toes curling her claws as she shouted and screamed at it. A murder of what might have once been crows fell into the yard, squawking as they stalked through the grass. Blue turned to them, snarled, and roared so loud that it shook the broken window pane. The birds, twisted, featherless things with white heads, silver eyes, and fleshy wings, jumped back in a flurry of squawks and chirps, rising up on long legs and flapping. Blue lurched forward, and half of the murder took wing to land somewhere higher. The rest, however, ran around her. A few hissed, and even ran up to her face. She snarled and lunged, catching one of the birds in her jaw and gnashing it to death, blood and viscera slinging across the dewy yard. But another flew up around, falling on her face with its long and longer legs, grabbing her lips and screeching. It brought its beak down and tore at her forehead and cheeks. Blue yelped, and Michael jumped up, ready to run out. But then he stopped, jaw clenched as she continued to whimper and then roar. He sank back down and slid onto the floor, gun set aside as he leaned his back against the wall, heart racing as that little happy puppy's face barked behind his eyes. He took a shaky breath and clenched his fists, ignoring the image, ignoring the memories. "You're not Blue," anymore. The fog took her. Day 25. Michael stood at the sink, newly filled gin bottle open beside him as he sipped from a glass, leaning on the counter, eyes sore, red, and wet as he looked outside at what used to be blue. She sat on the lawn, tail long and prehensile as it flicked side to side over the grass, body too long to let her sit any way but side saddle, her face short, almost human. Her pale gold eyes glinted in the outside lights like the rest of her silvery fur and the patches of scales down the loose skin of her neck. The quills on her back and shoulders twinkled like broken glass. Her tall ears were even taller. The fur on her skull had grown long and loose, falling in waves over her muscled neck like a shaggy boy. She didn't smile. She didn't frown or scowl or weep. She didn't look to him with longing. She just watched him and occasionally licked the dried blood from the corners of her mouth, left over from her prey. At least you have the decency to throw the scraps over the edge instead of letting them rot around the yard, he whispered to himself before he took another drink. He sighed and turned, grabbing the bottle by the neck and taking it and his glass into the living room, sitting on the couch and flicking on the television to restart the movie that he'd seen 5 times in 2 days. He could almost repeat the lines verbatim, but had forgotten the name. It didn't really matter anyway, did it? Then a shadow moved across the broken window, shards held together with 4 layers of duct tape. Blue rose up from under the sill, far away from the cracks. The same face as always, the same stare as always, the same languid tilt to her body as she watched him, and he ignored her. Though he couldn't always. His eyes would flick to hers for a moment every now and then, but the alcohol seemed to numb him of care whether she was there or not. Maybe that's what she wants, he thought. Me to be numb and drunk and stupid so she can break in and gobble me up for locking her outside. Well, you shouldn't have creeped me out like that, he slurred, eyes on the television. You don't just watch people sleep from the foot of their beds like a sleep paralysis demon, Blue. You just don't. Silence blossomed beside the low hum of the horror movie, his wife's 3rd favorite, until he sighed and turned his head to stare at Blue, not caring when his eyes burned or spilled over with tears from dryness, not caring when she licked her lips, not caring when she set her hand-like paw on the sill and fogged up the window with her breath. He stared and drank and stared until the tears weren't from dry eyes. Then he poured another glass. Day 29. Tap, tap, tap came the dining room window, and again, and again. Michael sighed as he sipped his coffee and nibbled at the toast and eggs before him. He set the mug down and leaned on the table. Tap, tap, tap. He stirred his food around with the fork, scraping the plate and sending chills down his back at the screech. Tap, tap, tap. He shut his eyes, hands balling up across the table in front of his plate. Tap, tap, tap. He squeezed them tighter until he saw swimming colors. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. He whirled around, hands sliding under his plate as he stood, chair tumbling back, and hurled his breakfast at the drawn curtains in a blur. The plate and food fell to the ground with a clang and thankfully didn't shatter. He gritted his teeth, staring at the stupid patterns spread across the old drapes he'd drug out from the basement to keep from seeing Blue's continuously changing form, her silent, intelligent eyes. Tap, 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 came Blue's claws against the glass outside. Tap, tap, tap. He sighed, setting the chair back in place and scraping the ruin of his breakfast back onto the plate to set it beside the sink. He'd find a way to throw it over the edge later. Tap, 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 came the window over the sink. He sighed and leaned on the counter, both hands outstretched either side of him. He inched his head up, face expressionless as a corpse as he stared at the chopped-up blanket that he'd used to cover the glass, imagining the horror that Blue had become since last he saw her. If her quills had grown into spines yet, if her paws were hands yet, if her face had become human, if her tail had forked or grown a stinger, if her fangs had become a jumbled mess, dripping venom, if her hunched, hulking body had finally come upright like an ape playing at being a bear. Tap, tap, tap. "I hear you, Blue," he whispered, looking down and away with heavy eyes and a broken sigh. Silence. His eyebrows quirked up, grip lightening on the edge of the sink as he stared at the blanket. Maybe she wasn't all gone. Maybe he had acted too hastily. Maybe his friend, the only one in his whole shrunken world, was still out there, and he'd shut her out. Tap, 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 tap. Or maybe she was gone, and the thing wearing her skin only remembered him and its life as Blue, and didn't understand why it couldn't have it when she could. Like how a tiger can't understand why it can't roam a city street, while all those other cats roam the back alleys. Day 33. The creature that had crawled out from beneath one of the remaining shelves in the garage was almost like a rat, maybe a squirrel, but it was bald, albino, and big as a dog. It blinked lazy, clouded eyes as it sniffed the air, turning its head to the doorway where Michael stood, shotgun cocked and ready to fire. He took a slow breath, and the creature cocked its head. It flew across the floor and slammed into Michael, screeching like a strangled baby as they went sprawling across the floor. The shotgun went off and blasted the wall and ceiling as the mutated thing sank its needle claws into his chest through the black cotton shirt. He yelled, slamming the hilt of the gun into the side of its face as it peeled its bifurcated lips back to reveal massive, dripping, shoveled teeth. It screeched and tumbled across the floor, flipping onto its paws and jumping through the stair rails. It hissed, peeling back its gray flesh and standing upright, loose skin sagging from its sides in scaly folds. Michael readied to fire, but as he stepped forward his boots slid in a puddle of the creature's mucus. He went sprawling back, and it winced, then jumped after him. He groaned and spun on the floor, bolting on hands and knees, sliding back down over and over until he got to the front door. The creature scuttled after him, long tail stiff and flicking like it had fused into one long bone. He spun, pushing onto his feet as he fell back and propping himself up with the wall by the door. The creature leapt onto him and sank its teeth into his forearm. Michael screamed and fell forward, slamming his knee into its guts and pommeling its head with his left fist, gun rattling to the floor somewhere. It wouldn't let go. He stood straight, free hand on the thing's nape and pulling its loose skin tight across its throat as he spun and slammed its body into the front door. Its teeth, however, only sank deeper. "I'll lose the hand at this point," he screamed in his head, as he opened his mouth in a guttural war cry and rammed the creature into the front door with his whole body. 2 of the wooden planks cracked, but it didn't let go, only loosened, so he reared back and ran at the door again and again until the 2 planks broke and the creature went slack. He grabbed its lower jaw and ripped it open, whipping it off of his arm to lay like a pile of flesh on the hardwood beside the broken planks and those that he'd already taken off to replace with metal. He panted, heart racing as he stared at the creature, then lifted his arm to inspect the wound and treat it before the adrenaline wore off. It wasn't as deep as he'd thought, but he'd have to stitch it himself shut, or risk infection. He flexed his hand, moved his wrist, and squeezed his hands together. Dexterity, mobility, and feeling, he thought, and continued aloud, panting. I'll take a win. Then he found the creature, sneered, and took off the remaining planks before he could stop himself. The front door was open, the creature's nape was in one hand, and his gun in the other, and he was dragging it over the porch. There was something else in the yard, motion at the edge of his vision, but all that mattered in that moment was that stupid rat. He set the barrels in its mouth, his forearm weeping as he scowled and pulled the trigger, blasting blood, bone, and brains across the front yard. He dropped it to the steps and stared, eyes, mouth, and face hard and hateful, before he furrowed his brows at the growing screeches and roars. He blinked, and the blood in his ears was overtaken by feral shouts. He looked up as something flew at what Blue had become, its wings pterosaur-like with 2 digits, feet like an army of clawed fingers, big as a man, with a long skeletal face and lipless mouth full of backward curved fangs. He dropped the gun as it landed on Blue, claws raking down her flat face and pulling her around by the long mat of unkempt hair. She screamed in a human voice, arms reaching up like a gorilla and curved claws gouging the creature's chest. It flapped its wings with a scream, mouth opening like its jaw wasn't even attached. Then it bent in half and snapped its mouth shut on Blue's head, teeth puncturing an eye. She yelped and screamed like Debbie when she woke from a nightmare, like his wife did the night before she died, and the rifle filled his hand again, pulled up from his waistband. He jumped over the mutated rat, took stance, and fired 3 rounds, one puncturing the bat's wing, another grazing its hole for a snout, and the other landing in its thigh. The creature reared back, shoving Blue down so it could climb into the air and disappear on the back of a gale. The gun drooped in his hands, but he never broke stance, eyeing Blue as she staggered to hands and crooked knees and fell down to her humanoid hips. She gasped and groaned, a clawed hand finding her side as dark blood stained her crystal-white fur and trickled over the cream alligator scales on her belly. She looked up with her one eye, wincing and panting until she found Michael. He swallowed, hands trembling the longer he looked at her face. His wife's face. Tears welled, but he didn't lower the gun. He backed up to the porch and climbed the steps, only breaking eye contact when he slid back inside and slammed the planks back in place. He leaned his back against the wall and let the tears fall as he shut his eyes and saw her face, Blue's and his wife's, blended together like that had always been her. He lifted his arm and winced, sighing and wiping his nose before he cleared his throat and looked for something to clean the wound with. Day 34. Michael stood across from the front door, the house dark for the curtains and blankets over the windows. He took a deep breath, letting the silence wash over him as he stepped forward, then back again. He chewed his cheek. He took a step, then another, then backed away from the door and listened. His eyes flitted over it and the wooden planks he hadn't replaced yet, stopping on the door handle. He blinked and spun, pushing into the living room and pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek through. The front yard was littered with yesterday's blood and odd insects that buzzed around it, and the carcass by the porch steps. He pulled the curtain open further and blinked against the sting of light, looking right until he saw his car, dented and clawed apart, and Blue lying next to it, dark blood pooling beneath her as her chest spasmed up and down. He swallowed and his wife's face appeared behind his eyes, like she had been when she was healthy, when she was sick, when she lay dying in their bed with hospice, and then yesterday. He blinked, and tears trekked down his cheeks. When he opened them again, he was walking to the front door and taking the handle. He pulled it open and let the cool, moist air brush his face beside the smell of blood and flesh, stepping onto the porch and ignoring the winged, spidery things feasting on the dead rat, eyes fixed on Blue. Then his feet pulled him down the steps and the front path to the drive. He stood still and watched her breathe, hands shaking, breath ragged and hoarse, heart fluttering as he took another step, then another, until he was right in front of her. She lay with her back to the mutilated car, body a giant, almost human, if not for the satyr-like legs, spines, scales, and snowy skin. She clutched her gut, wincing when she shifted, her hair half covering her face, her human face. She groaned, and he knelt, hairs standing on end and gut churning, telling him to run from the dangerous predator. But he stayed, and sank to his knees to sit on his heels, reaching a tentative hand out to the hair and brushing it aside. His mouth twisted, eyes hot as he tried for a smile, and only gasped at his wife's face. Her eyes opened, one silver white, the other a mangle of flesh, and found his face. She looked him up and down, frowning in pain, lips quivering as his hand settled on her cheek, thumb stroking the soft skin. "Blueberry?" he whispered. She smiled almost bitterly and looked down at her gut. But when she found him again, she pouted, tears falling sideways as her mouth twisted, and she gasped.
"Michael,"
she said in his wife's voice.
"I'm glad you came back."
He frowned a smile, wide and tender as tears fell silently, and pulled himself closer, taking her free hand and squeezing it. "I never left, Blue. I had to keep you away." She smiled sadly.
I know. I remember now. I understand what I was, what I am."
She squeezed his hand, claws tickling his skin as his smiling frown threatened to curve too far down, to quiver and snap.
"Hey,"
she breathed, her eye clouding over as her breathing slowed, the blood coming less and less from her wound.
"It's okay. I understand, Michael. I would have hurt you. You had to let me go. But I never forgot you. I couldn't leave you forever."
His voice cracked even as he tried to keep himself from shattering. She smiled the way that his wife had the day that she died, that small, quivering lift at the corners of her mouth with a calm face.
"I know. You came when it mattered. You're here for me. Thank you."
"I love you," he croaked, unsure if he said it to his wife, or Blue, or both. He leaned forward and said it again, and again, like she couldn't hear him, even as she smiled and kissed his cheek, lips brushing the same spot that his wife's had on her last day. When he pulled back, Face slack and tears flowing, the fog, the car, Blue's matted body, it was all gone. It was their bedroom. His wife under their covers, a beanie covering her bald head as she looked up at him with hollow eyes.
"I love you,"
he whispered, squeezing her hand hard. She smiled and shut her eyes, head lolling onto the ground, onto the pillow of their bed.
"I love you too, Michael. Thank you for everything."
She rattled deep and sharp.
"I remember. I'm sorry, but I think I have to go."
And her words drifted on a long breath until her chest was empty, and it didn't rise again. Michael stared as the memory bled away to Blue and the fog and his purgatory. He stared, frozen, watching her face, his wife's face, slack-jawed and wide-eyed as his hands wrapped around hers, massaging her skin as he slid to his hip, mouth crinkling up as he folded in half to kiss her fingers. He held her hand on his face, breathing her in, eyes open and blind for the tears as he took a sharp breath and sobbed. His eyes squeezed shut, wringing his tears and his breath as his mouth crept open. But there was no sound, no scream, no shout, no wail. He breathed, the air like a whine and whistle in his throat, like he were a boy choking on his sobs at his mother's feet. He sat with her and mourned. He pulled himself to her body and lay over it, face turned to the side, arms outstretched, one hand still twined with hers as he went between staring at her face to staring into the fog when he couldn't bear it any more. He stayed with her until the tears dried and he was too weak to sob. He stayed with her as the light dimmed. He shuffled onto his side as night came, his hand wrapped around hers, and watched her motionless face until his eyes shut. Day 35. As the light of the fog dimmed like late afternoon, Michael sat in the grass, sweat and dew collecting on his skin. He'd managed to pull Blue's body across the yard, but she was so massive there was no hope of him taking her to the backyard to be buried. So there she lay in the fresh mound of dark earth, head pointed at the house with a near-empty bottle of gin on its side beside her. Michael took the last gulp from his glass and refilled it to take another long sip. He capped the bottle and sighed, pulling his knees to his chest before his eyes found Blue's grave, and he drank again. "I wonder if you'll come back," he slurred. "Or if I have to push you over to get another one." He stared at the mound of dirt like it might answer, then sighed when none came. "But I won't dig you back up. No point. My Blue's gone anyway." His legs relaxed, one falling straight to the ground as he propped his drinking hand on the other knee, staring into the fog's swirling curtains, calmer than the last week. My Blue. His eyes crept over to his glass as he brought it up to sip from. He stopped before it touched his lips and held it up to the light, spinning it around and around before he clicked his tongue on the beginning of his thought. "I wonder if you'll come back, or if it's just food that wanders back up here when it's gone." He would have smirked, thought that he should, but there wasn't enough care to move his face any more than there was to eat. He sighed and stood, stumbling through a teetering world to the dark Christmas lights. He held the glass out straight, and it slipped through his fingers, tumbling into the fog. He stared down a moment before he turned on his heels and stumbled back to sit next to Blue's grave. Then he pulled the bottle cap off and turned the gin over, gulping 3 times before he set it down with a hiss and stared into the distance. Silent. Day 36. He sat up out of bed and walked the hall to look out the window to Blue's grave, face stone as the dirt still sat undisturbed. He went downstairs and stopped in the garage doorway, taking a breath before he flipped the light on and found her bed. Empty. He turned, shutting off the light and closing the door behind him as he shuffled into the kitchen and went about his routine at the coffee station, eyes not daring to find the picture of his wife. He stopped before he poured the sugar into his mug and looked over his shoulder to the fridge and the bottle of gin that should have been refilled by then. He grabbed it out of the freezer, full and frosted, then went to the cup cabinet and creaked the doors open. The glass he drank from yesterday was still gone. Well, that answers that, he said under his breath and grabbed another glass, then stopped. 2 birds, he breathed, shutting the cabinet and returning to his coffee, pouring the gin in, then the creamer, and sipping. He screwed up his face, but sipped again, as he made his way to the dining table and sat and sipped in silence. Day 37. Michael sat on the couch, staring out of the cracked front window. Day 38. Michael lay in his bed, ignoring the ticking clock as the day passed him by, mind racing around nothing and unable to slip into sleep. Day 39. Michael stood in front of the coffee stand, watching the maker perk with his head hung, sighing through his nostrils as his stomach rumbled. He ignored it for the 2nd day in a row and picked up the pot, filling a mug and reaching for the sugar when something tapped against the face of the house. He stopped and thought to look over his shoulder, but then just fell back into pouring the sugar and creamer. He brought the cup to his lips, letting the steam warm his chilly nose as he breathed in the smell. He shut his eyes and pulled himself up straight, wincing at the crick in his neck and the pops in his back. He sipped his coffee, eyes opening, half-lidded and clouded over as they were, as the hot drink swam onto his tongue. He looked at it blankly and set the mug down, whispering to himself, "Not really what I want, I guess. That hasn't happened in a while." He sighed, scooping up the cup as he turned and rubbed his eyes, walking around the table to grab the back of the chair and stare past the curtains to the dark clouds surrounding his house. He sipped the coffee again, drinking without tasting as another clump of knocks came from the front. He set the cup down and shuffled around, stomach roaring up at him as he moved to the living room window, scoping the front yard and stopping on the cluster of flying creatures lighting around Blue's grave, big as cranes with pterosaur wings and covered in downy hair, their beaks massive and their eyes black. He sighed and passed the door to return to his coffee when 3 loud bangs stopped him. He furrowed his brow and faced the front door, inching closer as he tried to convince himself that it wasn't knocking. Just some monster, he told himself. The bangs came again, and he swallowed, grabbing one of the wooden planks and staring, through the plank and deep into the choice. He cursed and pulled the planks off, eyes full of stars by the end as he strained, arms weak and thinner than before. Then he took the handle and creaked it open, freezing when he saw the girl, then flinging it open wide when he recognized her, and throwing his arms around her, falling to his knees when she didn't disappear. "Dad!" She half giggled and hugged him back. He squeezed, eyes hot and wet as he struggled to control his breathing, pulling her against him tighter as she coughed and laughed. "You're choking me!" He chuckled and pulled back, tears trailing his cheeks as he found her face, just as she had been before all this started. The same 12-year-old girl with long black hair and dark eyes, skinny like her father but tan like her mother. She was still Debbie. "Baby, I'm so glad to see you." He cupped her face, smiling wide and pulling her head forward to pepper her with kisses. She laughed and pushed him off. Then he sat back and looked around, finding her in the end as his smile drooped. How'd you get here?"
"I don't know,"
she said, her face drooping, eyes flicking like she were trying to remember.
"I was in bed. You closed my door. Then I woke up standing in the yard and everything was misty and the car's broken and you have Christmas lights around the house?"
He licked his lips, eyes darting over to Blue's grave as more things collected around it, veiny wings flapping as they landed from all around, calling with a low rumble that they shouldn't have been able to make. Debbie went to turn at the noise, but he caught her face and pulled it back to him. "Okay, come inside, baby. There's some things we need to figure out."
"Daddy, what's going on?"
"It's all right. We just need to come inside, okay?" He stood and led her in with a hand on the back of her shoulder, shutting the door and putting the planks back in place. The world spun, and he caught himself on the wall before he fell.
"Daddy!"
"I'm all right, just dizzy," he said, blinking the spots away and controlling his breathing. He cleared his throat and stood straight, testing his feet before he brought her into the kitchen. "We both need to eat, okay? And we can talk while we work." He smiled down at her the way adults always do to children when something serious is happening. He sighed when she pouted and crossed her arms. "I know things don't make sense, but Daddy needs to eat 'cause he doesn't feel well."
"Did you forget to eat again?"
He smirked and started pulling out food from the fridge. Something simple. "Maybe."
"Dad, you can't keep doing that. Come on, let's make you breakfast."
"Hey, who's the adult here?"
"You, but we're making you breakfast 'cause you forget all the time."
He smiled sadly and stopped to kiss the top of her head. "I've missed you, Debbie Cake."
"Missed me? How long was I gone?"
She smirked up at him as he began cracking eggs, and she whisked. "Well, that's one of the things we need to talk about."
"Blue,"
she called as she opened the pack of blueberries.
"Blue, come girl, I have a treat."
His stomach dropped. "Baby..."
"Where is she?"
she asked, looking up at him. "That's something we need to talk about." Hey y'all, thanks for listening. Make sure you leave a like and comment down below if you liked this video. Subscribe to help grow the channel and ring the bell so you can stay up to date with my bi-weekly uploads. And share a video to someone if you think that they would enjoy a Charlie original. Every little bit goes a long way, trust me. Alright, well that's all from me. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.